lesson for Sunday, October 18th, is entitled Power That Produces Wholeness. The key verse is from Mark 8, verse 18, which says, "Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember?" The scripture is from Mark 7, verses 31 through 37, and 8, verses 14 through 25. The lesson focus is Jesus has power to overcome the limitations and diseases we face. In the overview, it says that God does the miraculous. He is a God of miracles. When He acts miraculously on our behalf, it is often not only a moment of compassion, but also learning. God invites us to receive from Him and also to deepen our understanding of Him. In the introduction, it says, "The only people who receive miracles are those who need them." We can spend our lives seeking to insulate ourselves against high expectations. Low expectations generate few disappointments. How easy it is to construct lives aimed at eliminating our own vulnerability or isolating ourselves from those in great need. We can retreat from the arena of dependency upon the supernatural work of God. We might even try to live a risk-free faith. But such faith is really no faith at all. Remember, today's impossible situation may become tomorrow's glorious testimony. In part 1, it says that Jesus attracts the desperate, and the text is from Mark 7, verses 31 through 35, which says, "Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged him to place his hand on him. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven, and with a deep sigh said to him, 'Ephphatha,' which means, 'be opened.' At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. People sought Jesus. As he moved from place to place throughout the land of Israel, he became the focus of their hopes. The Gospels are filled with incidents of people bringing seeming impossible situations to Jesus. Loved ones and friends were often escorted into the presence of Jesus by miracle-seeking companions. Displays of the supernatural power of God were part of the continuing magnetism that drew others in the life and ministry of Jesus. He attracted the desperate. Many came believing that what was impossible for them was possible with Him. The Bible does not tell us who, but some people brought to Him a man. They seemed to be gripped by the same faith evidenced by the men who lowered their friend through the roof into the presence of Jesus. We know little about this person except his condition. The man was deaf and could hardly talk. These persons who brought the man did so with an intense desire to see a miracle in his life. They begged Jesus to lay His hands upon him. They were desperate. At the time of Christ, this man would have been considered unclean, an issue faced by Jesus in Mark 7, verses 1 through 9. Touching him would have been considered spiritually contaminating. Many Jews would have stepped back, not forward. They would have withdrawn, rather than being an inviting target of their compassion. He would have been an obstacle to bypass. But Jesus was constantly rearranging spiritual values. Jesus took the man aside, away from the crowd. His goal was obviously not for public display, but healing grace. Jesus refused to succumb to the clamor for the spectacular or to allow His ministry to be reduced to a public spectacle. He was motivated by compassion, not celebrity status. Jesus put His fingers into the man's ears. Then He spit and touched the man's tongue. There's no explanation, nor is this a formula. Mark merely describes the occurrence. Accompanied by the prayerful command of Ephphatha, which means be opened, a miracle took place. The source of the miracle was not in some magical formula to be duplicated, but in the living Christ who exercised his power. Suddenly the man was healed by Jesus. His ears were opened, and his tongue loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus performed a healing miracle. The hopes and dreams of the man's companions were satisfied in the touch of the Master's hand. In part 2, it says that Jesus' miracles are electrifying, and the text is from Mark 7, verses 36 and 37, which says, Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Jesus apparently was not prepared to go public, or perhaps he did not want his healing power to become the focus of his ministry. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone. Jesus sought to minimize the public awareness by taking the man apart from the crowd and discouraging open announcement of the incident. Yet the man's transformation seized attention. It is not apparent whether it was the whole crowd or only the people who had brought him to Jesus, but in either case, his exhortations to keep it under wraps went unheeded. They could not be silent in the presence of such a miracle from God. The more Jesus said, "Shh," the more vocal they became. The sense of amazement pressed in upon them. Imagine how they must have felt as they observed this before and after evidence of God's power. It seems only predictable that people would want to tell of what they had seen and heard. The miracle then became a launching event to extol the virtues of Jesus. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. The reaction to Jesus' miracle galvanized his reputation. The display of supernatural power immediately elevated him in their eyes. This incident became a springboard for an almost universal affirmation. The ripple effect of seeing the deaf and mute man hearing and speaking was potent. It is easy to assume that such a display of the power of God would never be forgotten. Once having seen God do the impossible, we could easily conclude that it would be common to believe God the next time. Before long, however, the clamor was not for Jesus, but against him. While we might anticipate that observing a miracle would silence any doubts about Jesus, such was not the case. Our faith is sometimes only as deep as our most pressing need, or our willingness to believe anew and afresh. The elation of a miracle can be short-lived ecstasy and a forgotten blessing. In part 3 it says, Jesus is easily misunderstood, and the text is from Mark 8, verses 14 through 25, which says, The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf that they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, It is because we have no bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. He said to them, Do you still not understand? They came to Bethesda, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, Do you see anything? He looked up and said, I see people. They look like trees walking around. Once more Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were open. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. It is easy to assume that witnessing a miracle would forever solidify a person's faith. Once seeing Jesus do the impossible would erase doubt completely. But such is not the case. While earlier in this chapter we discovered Jesus miraculously feeding the 4,000, the disciples had already forgotten. Jesus' questions unmasked them and revealed that they just weren't getting it. With the backdrop of the previous miracle of the man who was deaf and mute, Jesus asked them, "Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear?" How quickly we forget, failing to remember the displays of God that so energized us. Yesterday's miraculous display does not always dispel today's fear. How easy it is to forget what God has done and thus can do. Sometimes our memories are filled with events that have ceased to stimulate the fountain of faith within. Jesus and his disciples were missing in their communication. He was warning them about the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod, which was focused on blatantly testing Jesus, forcing him to prove himself again and again. Jesus was seeking to caution them about that doubting spirit. But the disciples were focused on tangible issues, immediate issues, like bread. They were more concrete thinkers. This tension seems to have taken the next miracle and turned it into a teaching moment. The miracle of the blind man at Bethesda seems strategically placed. It may be as much a subtle message as it is a record of a divine miracle. A blind man's friends brought him to Jesus and begged Jesus to touch him. Jesus again tried to maintain a low profile by taking the man outside the village. He spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him. The immediate effect was improvement, but still less than desirable. The man said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Jesus touched the man again, placing his hands on his eyes. This time his eyes were open. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Whereas the miracle of healing of the deaf and mute man seems to have been instantaneous, this one unfolded within a process. The writer of Mark seems to have been making a point in his placement of these incidents. Sometimes God's work in our lives has an instantaneous impact. Other times there is a process involved. That is true not only with healing, but, as the disciples discovered, with understanding as well. The miraculous display of God's power is not an end in itself. The purpose is to deepen our understanding and grasp of Jesus himself. The design is not to impress, but to connect us ever more firmly in faith to him. In today's life application, it says, this week, consider the miracles God has done in your life. Remember, a miracle is when God does something for you that could not be done without him. After identifying the miracle, answer this question: how has that event affected my walk with God? Second, seek out at least 3 people and ask them, have you ever had a miracle happen in your life? Ask them to describe the miracle to you. Then, inquire how that miracle has affected their faith in God.